The change siren rang in my chest as I crossed the golden gate of Vista Paradiso, a condo that promised exclusivity and luxury in every square inch of its perfectly trimmed gardens. After 15 years on the police force, I finally reached the position of chief, and this was going to be my fresh start, a home that showed off my achievement. The welcome sign gleamed in the afternoon sun, where luxury meets harmony. 3 days after settling in, I found the first red envelope pinned to my door. "Notice of violation," screamed in all caps. The paper detailed that my vehicle wasn't registered with the Homeowners Association and demanded my immediate presence at the admin office. I ignored it. The next morning, a second envelope arrived, this time listing a fine of $150 for non-compliance. The letter mentioned rules that no one had told me about when I bought the place. On the third day, while I was watering some plants I'd brought from my old house, a skinny man in dark sunglasses walked confidently across my lawn. "Mr. Anderson? I'm Bradley Wilson, the HOA's executive officer. You ignored our notices." "I'm still getting settled," I replied without stopping my watering. "Your flowers haven't been approved by the landscaping committee," he said, pointing at my geraniums. "And your blue curtains violate the aesthetic code in Section 8, Paragraph 12. I raised an eyebrow. I didn't know I needed permission for curtains. Absolutely everything needs approval. This is a high-end community. We have rules. Subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to catch more stories like this. The notifications only piled up the following week. One about a non-standard doormat. Another about the incorrect shade of the plant pot in my porch. A third mentioned that my car was parked 3 centimeters outside the line. I couldn't help but notice the disturbing pattern. My neighbors were living under constant surveillance. The Johnson family at number 24 took down their colorful kids' swing after a bunch of fines. The Millers replaced their flowers with approved shrubs, all identical in size and shape. The whole neighborhood felt like it was under a strange regime of aesthetic conformity. On a Tuesday morning, while I was having coffee on the porch, Bradley came back, this time with a burly man holding a clipboard. "Mr. Anderson, this is Robert Jenkins, our compliance officer," Bradley introduced. "We're here to document your multiple violations. Tell me, Bradley, what crimes did I commit today? Plant too many flowers? Or maybe my doormat is too cheerful?" "This is not the time for sarcasm," Robert interjected, snapping pictures of my garden. "Your lawn is 0.5 centimeters above the permitted limit, and these geraniums aren't on the approved list." "I'll consider your suggestion," I replied, turning back inside. "This isn't a suggestion," Bradley raised his voice. "It's an order that needs immediate compliance." The real confrontation happened on a Thursday night. I'd just gotten out of the shower when I heard voices in my garden. Through the windows, I could see 2 shadows roaming my property with flashlights. I quickly got dressed, grabbed my badge, and headed out the back door. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Bradley and Robert jumped in surprise. Bradley's flashlight shone on my face. "We're inspecting your violations," he said curtly. "At midnight? On private property without permission?" "The HOA has the right to access for inspections," Robert said, adjusting his clipboard. "Not without a 48-hour notice and my consent. You're trespassing." Bradley stepped forward. "Look, we need you to understand how serious this is. This community has standards." "And I have this," I said, flashing my badge. "James Anderson, Chief of Police. Now, you have exactly 10 seconds to leave my property before I arrest you for trespassing." Bradley's face drained of color. Robert dropped his clipboard. "You didn't mention that during the registration," Bradley stuttered. "You never registered me in the first place. Remember? Now get out." The silence lasted only 2 days. On Saturday morning, a different envelope, this time golden, appeared in my mailbox. A formal subpoena for a disciplinary hearing at the community hall, listing 17 rule violations. The document was signed by Walter Crawford, president of the HOA board. Instead of reacting, I decided to prepare. I talked discreetly with other residents. The Thompsons told me about fines for leaving children's toys in the yard for more than an hour. An elderly neighbor from number 36 was paying extra fees because his cane scratched the lobby floor. I installed security cameras at strategic points around my house. I requested the association's financial records through official channels. I discovered that Vista Paradiso's HOA was collecting almost $300,000 a year in fines, an absurdly disproportionate amount for a condo with 68 homes. The night before the hearing, I caught Bradley lurking around my house again, this time trying to mess with my water meter. I kept those recordings safe. The community center was packed for what was supposed to be my hearing. Walter Crawford, a thin man in a sharp suit, presided over the session. Next to him stood 4 other board members, including a stern-looking woman introduced to me as Patricia Davis, the vice president. Mr. Anderson, Walter began after the formalities, you have accumulated an impressive number of violations in record time. Your lack of cooperation shows disrespect for the standards that maintain our community's excellence. A projector behind him displayed photos of my infractions. Unapproved flowers, curtains of the wrong color, the height of the lawn. Before we go any further, I calmly interrupted, I'd like to present some evidence of my own. This isn't a two-way hearing, Mr. Anderson, Patricia cut in. You're here to listen to the board's decisions. I stood up calmly. Actually, gentlemen, this meeting is about to take a different turn. I hooked up my laptop to the projector. As the chief of police here in this city, I've opened a formal investigation into some potentially illegal practices by this association. The first slide showed Bradley and Robert breaking into my property at night. The next slide revealed Bradley tampering with my water meter. I have records from 18 families who experienced systematic bullying, documented arbitrary fines, and serious financial irregularities in the association's accounts. The room fell into absolute silence. The silence in the community hall quickly turned into a growing murmur. Walter Crawford cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Chief Anderson, these accusations are completely unfounded and, frankly, defamatory, he declared, nervously adjusting his tie. I suggest you end this presentation immediately. I'm not done yet, I said, moving to the next slide. Here we have the HOA's financial records from the past 3 years. Notice the 340% increase in fine collections with no corresponding upgrade to the condo's facilities. An elderly lady in the third row stood up. We paid $500 last month because our grandson left a bike on the lawn for 2 hours. And we got fined because our curtains were overly floral, another resident added. I kept my cool as chaos grew in the room. I noticed Susan Mitchell, one of the board members, whispering urgently in Walter's ear. The evidence shows a systematic pattern of abuse of authority, I continued. And as a public servant sworn to enforce the law, I can't ignore these violations. Bradley Wilson abruptly stood up. This is absurd. We have statutory authority over this condo. Statutory authority limited by law, Mr. Wilson. The HOA can't trespass on private property without prior notice. It can't impose fines without due process, and it certainly can't divert community funds into personal accounts. I projected a bank document on the screen. This is a transfer of $75,000 from the HOA Reserve Fund to a shell company registered under the name Gregory Parker. I pointed to a middle-aged man seated next to Walter, who suddenly looked pale. Patricia Davis slammed the table. This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Anderson, you will receive notice from our attorneys. My attorneys are looking forward to it, I replied calmly. So is the district attorney. When the meeting dissolved into complete chaos, I walked over to Walter. This is just the beginning, Mr. Crawford. You'd better start preparing your defense. On my way home, several residents approached me, sharing their own stories of intimidation. The Johnsons revealed that they'd been fined $200 for painting their door in a shade of blue, not on the approved palette. The Millers recounted threats of foreclosure when they challenged a fine for leaving Christmas lights up 3 days past the deadline. Each story confirmed my suspicions. Vista Paradiso's HOA had turned into a kingdom of petty tyranny, where arbitrary rules only fed the egos and wallets of its administrators. Retaliation started the very next morning. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. From the window, I saw a black car speeding down the street. In my garden, my geraniums had been ripped out and scattered across the lawn, and a brick lay among the shards of my favorite vase. I didn't show any visible reaction. I just silently documented the damage on my phone and checked the security camera footage. Bradley was clearly identifiable, even with his face partially hidden by a cap. 3 days later, I found all 4 tires of my car flat. The following week, I received a fake foreclosure notice printed on counterfeit letterhead from the bank. The cameras captured Robert Jenkins dropping it into my mailbox. They're getting desperate, I remarked to my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, as she watched a technician installing more cameras outside my home. People who abuse their power usually panic when they realize they're losing it. We're all tired of it, Chief Anderson, she admitted. Before you came along, it was like living in a police state. Michael wanted to sell his house after we got fined $800 because our kid built a treehouse. Things are gonna change, I promised. On Friday, I received a preliminary report from the police finance department. The records showed that more than $2 million in HOA funds had been misappropriated over the last 5 years. supposedly for maintenance services provided by companies controlled by board members themselves. I was reviewing these documents when I heard a loud noise coming from the backyard. It was almost 11 p.m. The outdoor cameras showed 3 masked figures breaking into my property, one of them carrying what looked like a spray can. I silently triggered the panic alarm that was directly connected to the police station and slipped out the back. I positioned myself strategically behind a tree near my deck as the intruders began vandalizing my house's front with red paint. "Police! Stop!" I shouted, shining my flashlight. The figure closest to me spun around sharply, revealing a baseball bat in his hands. Even behind the mask, I recognized Robert Jenkins' burly stance. The other two, one clearly Bradley because of his tall, thin frame, and the other probably Gregory Parker, hesitated for a moment before dashing off in different directions. The sirens started wailing in the distance, getting closer fast. Robert tried to climb the fence but slipped in his haste. Bradley and Gregory managed to escape through the neighboring houses. When the patrol cars arrived, Robert was already cuffed on my lawn. With the mask off, his identity was clear. "Robert Jenkins, you're under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted assault," I formally declared as officers escorted him away. "Crawford's gonna destroy you," he muttered with hate. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Actually, Mr. Jenkins," I replied, "you should know better." At the station, Robert remained stubbornly silent, refusing to implicate his accomplices even when confronted with clear footage from the cameras. However, the physical evidence was undeniable. The gloves he wore had residues of the same spray paint found on my house, and his cell phone, seized as evidence, revealed an incriminating exchange with Walter Crawford. "Take care of the Anderson problem permanently," read Walter's final message. "No more mistakes." With that evidence in hand, I obtained search warrants for the homes and offices of all the HOA board members. The operation kicked off at 6 a.m. the next day. Coordinated teams arrived simultaneously at the houses of Walter Crawford, Bradley Wilson, Gregory Parker, Patricia Davis, and Susan Mitchell. The searches uncovered a treasure trove of evidence: forged financial documents, offshore account records, and even a detailed file of violations fabricated against residents who had challenged the board's authority. At Walter's house, investigators found a safe containing more than $200,000 in cash, labeled by date and the name of the fined resident. At Patricia's, they uncovered an elaborate scheme involving shell companies set up to provide services to the condo at inflated rates. Gregory's laptop held spreadsheets detailing how the fine money was split among the board members: 30% for Walter, 20% for each of the other 4 members. By 11 a.m., all 5 board members were being escorted to the police station, watched by dozens of residents who had come out onto the streets to witness the collapse of the regime that had terrorized them for years. Walter Crawford, his hands cuffed, glared at me as he was led to the patrol car. "You destroyed something perfect," he said. "We maintained order and excellence. Without us, this place is going to fall apart like any other ordinary suburb. What you call excellence, Mr. Crawford, was nothing but control. What you saw as order was oppression. A true community isn't built on fear." That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting at the community hall. Unlike last week's disciplinary hearing, this time the room was filled with relieved and curious faces. "As many of you already know," I began, "the 5 HOA board members were arrested this morning on charges including fraud, extortion, racketeering, and misappropriation of funds. The investigation is still ongoing, but preliminary evidence suggests that more than 80% of the money collected from fines never went toward benefiting the condo." An impromptu round of applause interrupted my speech. An elderly lady stood up, tears in her eyes. "They fined me when I planted roses in memory of my husband. They said red was emotionally disturbing for the community. The HOA, as it was structured, is no more," I continued. "Its remaining funds have been frozen due to the investigation. Now, it's up to you, as a community, to decide what comes next." Michael Thompson stood up. "We need some sort of association to maintain the common areas, but one that's based on democratic principles, transparency, and mutual respect." "Exactly," I agreed. "And I suggest we get started today. Whoever's interested in being part of a temporary committee to rework our neighborhood rules, please stick around after this meeting." Nearly everyone stayed. In the following days, I witnessed a remarkable transformation in Vista Paradiso. Families who barely knew each other started to chat openly, sharing ideas to improve the community. The Johnson family reinstalled their colorful swing for the kids. The Millers planted a vibrant garden with flowers of every color. A group of teenagers even organized a team to help elderly residents with their gardens. Walter Crawford and his cronies faced their custody hearing a week later. The judge denied bail, citing the risk of flight brought to light by the offshore accounts uncovered during the investigation. The most impressive thing, the prosecutor commented during our meeting, is how they managed to keep this scheme going for so long without anyone speaking up. Fear is a powerful tool, I replied. They threatened people with the loss of their homes, social isolation, constant harassment. In closed communities like this one, where the appearance of harmony is valued above all, people end up staying silent to avoid making trouble. Well, thanks to you, that cycle's been broken, he observed. It wasn't just me, I said. It took someone from outside the system to spark change, but the real transformation happened when the residents decided to take back their community. Subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to catch more stories like this. 6 months had passed since the HOA board's downfall. Vista Paradiso was blooming, literally. What used to be a visually homogeneous suburb had turned into a vibrant tapestry of personal expression. Every home now told its own unique story. The new resident association, democratically elected with limited terms, operated on principles of radical transparency. All meetings were open, accounts were published every month, and the few rules that were in place focused on safety and collective good, not on strict aesthetic control. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, I strolled through the neighborhood, marveling at the changes. The Johnson family had painted their house a cheerful turquoise that would have horrified Walter Crawford. In the Miller's yard, an elaborate stone garden melded naturally with native plants, creating an oasis of biodiversity. The Thompsons had installed solar panels on their roof, something that the old rules would have strictly forbidden. Mrs. Patel, a 78-year-old widow who rarely left her house under the previous regime, was now tending a lush garden of Indian spices that filled the entire street with fragrance. She waved at me happily as I passed by. "Chief Anderson, come try my fresh cardamom tea." I accepted the invitation, sitting on her porch adorned with colorful cushions and Tibetan prayer flags. Another violation under the old rules. "You know," she said while serving the aromatic tea, "I lived here for 12 years feeling like a stranger. Crawford once fined me because he claimed the scent of my curry was culturally disruptive to the community's vibe. Now, I host monthly community dinners where everyone brings a dish from their own cultural background. The community was always here," I replied. It just needed room to breathe. I continued my walk, stopping to chat with Michael Thompson, now the chair of the new resident committee, as he set up a small community library near the playground. Another innovation that would have been impossible under the old rules. "The cases against Crawford and the others are moving forward," Michael said with a smile. "The prosecutor says they could face up to 15 years combined. Justice takes its time," I replied. "The important thing is that you've gotten your community back." "Speaking of which," Michael grinned, "we're putting together our first spring festival next weekend. Live music, food stalls, activities for the kids. Something Walter would have deemed inappropriately festive and noisy. I wouldn't miss it for the world," I promised. On my way home, I passed the old HOA headquarters, now transformed into a community center. Through the windows, I saw a group of kids in an art class. The walls, once decorated with conformity charts and fine schedules, now displayed colorful children's drawings and a huge collaborative mural representing the neighborhood's diversity. In my own garden, the geraniums that had sparked so much trouble now bloomed exuberantly, surrounded by a diverse mix of flowers and herbs. A small wooden bench I put in place invited neighbors to pause and chat, something unthinkable under the old HOA, when spontaneous social interactions were discouraged for fear of causing visual clutter in the front space. That night, I sat on my porch watching families stroll peacefully through the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes without the fear of fines for unauthorized recreational equipment in common areas. Elderly couples walked hand in hand, stopping to admire the diverse gardens. Neighbors chatted on the sidewalks, swapping plants, recipes, and stories. The real luxury of Vista Paradiso was never its golden gates or its impeccably paved streets. The true luxury was the community that had always been there beneath the surface, just waiting for a chance to flourish. When I took over as chief of police in this city, I expected to face major challenges: organized crime, trafficking, violence. I never imagined that my first big victory would be taking down a mini tyranny disguised as a homeowners association. But maybe that was the most important lesson. Justice isn't just for the big crimes that make the headlines. Sometimes, the most insidious injustices are the ones that become normal in everyday life, hidden under the guise of rules and order. As the stars began to dot the night sky over Vista Paradiso, I realized I'd helped free not just a condo, but an entire community, including myself. In my police career, I've never felt as fulfilled as when I witnessed the transformation from a regime of fear to a true community built on mutual respect. The house lights in the neighborhood created a welcoming mosaic that night, each one with its unique glow, exactly as it should be. No more uniformity, no more strict controls, no more fear. Vista Paradiso was finally living up to its name, a vision of paradise, not imposed from above, but built together day by people free to be themselves, while respecting each other's freedoms. And that, I realized, was the true meaning of community. Subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to catch more stories like this.